What if you had a guide who could tell you how to bridge a gap between who you are today and who you're destined to be? What if each week you could hear a story of someone who has tried and succeeded, or perhaps tried and failed, but learned something in the process? Limitless Spirit is a weekly podcast where host Helen Todd interviews guests about topics and personal stories on defining life's purpose, pursuing personal growth, and developing a deeper faith in Christ.
It was only 6 weeks after we moved back to town that my husband went on one of his hikes. And so he would do the mountains that are over 14,000 feet in Colorado, and he'd hiked well over 30 of them. And on that hike, we don't know what happened, but he went missing for 6 days, and we didn't get to have him come back home. So that was definitely the day that my mountains crumbled. I think by the point that I lost my husband, I felt like, okay, yes, I'm tempted to just walk away, God.
Loss of a loved one, a relationship, or anything else that is important in your life can change your personality, your relationship with your friends and family. Sometimes it can even change your relationship with God. Welcome to this episode of the Limitless Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Helen Todd. And my guest today is Danita Jenae, who after 11 years as a military wife experienced very unexpected and tragic loss. Her husband was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force and was found dead while on a hiking trip in the mountains. So Danita, who was herself in the recovery process from an autoimmune disease, became a widow with 2 young daughters. Danita discovered that recovering from loss is a journey with very important stops along the way. In this interview, we talk about creative ways to cope with grief, the importance of lament, and what are the most comforting words you can tell someone who is going through grief. Hello, Danita. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit Podcast. How are you this morning?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you today. We're doing well.
I am excited to talk to you about your story. Your book just came out in March, and I think it's a very important subject, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. So tell us your story. What inspired you to write this book?
Yes, this was Devotional on Grief was not the book I thought I would write when I was called to be a writer when I was much younger. And I guess my story leading up to that is we're a military family. We had been stationed in Omaha before we moved to Colorado. And during that time in Nebraska, we were fighting for my own life. My health was really poor. We did not think I was going to make it. And so we learned to fast and pray and in a whole new level. And that's really when, that's really when I learned some hard lessons and some good lessons just about, my shortcomings and my frailness, the frailty of life. And we learned not to take any breath for granted. So during that time, towards the end of our season there, before we moved, God really did. He did a miracle in me and healed me. And then even my doctor was like, this can only be God. This is a miracle. And so that was pretty cool.
Wow. What was your health problem, if you don't mind me asking?
I had all kinds of, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but it was to the point where I was getting maybe half hour of sleep, maybe 2 hours broken up every night. And that went on for years. And your body literally just shuts down, your mind shuts down, and you kind of go crazy. So they had all kinds of guesses and different diagnoses, but at the end of the day, I don't know if anybody really knew. So we moved to Colorado with what we thought was going to be our last military move. My husband had only 1 year left to retire from the Air Force. He was a lieutenant colonel and just an amazing man of God. And after we showed up in town, we went on a little family hike, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm alive, like we're together and I'm alive and I'm hiking with you. And it was such an amazing moment of redemption. And then it was only 6 weeks after we moved back to town that my husband went on one of his hikes. He hiked the 14ers. And so he would do the mountains that are over 14,000 feet in Colorado, and he'd hiked well over 30 of them. And he was going to hit all 52 of them. And on that hike, we don't know what happened, but he went missing for 6 days, and we didn't get to have him come back home. So that was definitely the day that my mountains crumbled. It was the day that, everything that we thought, as a military family, we always said home is when we're together. And all of a sudden, we didn't even have that to lean on anymore. And we didn't have a home yet. We didn't have a church family yet. We were completely new in town and had to press into the Lord in a way that we hadn't been required to at that point yet. So,
how long had you been married?
We were married for 11 years before he passed away.
And so was he found eventually?
Yeah, they found his body. So it required a lot of search teams.
I'm so sorry. That is a very, very tragic situation. And so how did you get through this?
Yeah, part of me wants to say I have no idea, right?
Well, that's probably the most honest.
Yeah.
The most honest answer.
Yeah, and the other part of me knows that I think that's one of the foundational things I learned during my own health crisis when we thought I wasn't going to make it was I came to a place where I was like, okay, Lord, I have found you to be faithful even when I'm completely out of faith. And for me, remembering that through that season with losing my husband and then all of the trauma that followed and the crises that followed, I just know that he remained faithful. God remained faithful to our family, and he remained present even if he wasn't talkative, and he stuck by us. He kept his word. So I had to press through the emotions that are telling you he abandoned me. He's not here anymore. He doesn't care. We hear all those things and all that enemy chatter, and we just had to just hold on to what we knew is true, is that he really is still good, even if none of my circumstances are good.
The loss of a loved one often changes our relationship with family and with others. And sometimes it changes our relationship with God too. So how did losing your husband affect your relationship with God and your prayer life? I know that you have found him faithful through the process, but I'm assuming it wasn't like that at first.
Yeah, there's definitely times where it doesn't feel anything like faithfulness. And I think a big part of that was the ability to be honest with God about that and tell him, hey, you said you were defender of the widows. I don't feel defended right now. And to be able to proclaim his promises, it's for our sake just as much, right? Like it's just as much for our sake when we pray God's word and we say, hey, this is what your word says. My experience doesn't line up. I don't feel like that's true, but I am going to keep pressing in and asking you to redeem this and asking you to make that true. I need your defense, God. You promised to defend me. So there's definitely this whole we call it lament, but this whole process of wrestling with God is honestly, it's such a saving grace to be able to have the freedom to come to a Father in heaven and say honestly how we're doing and honestly how we're feeling. Because otherwise, if we just pretend that we're fine, Jesus said he doesn't come for the well, he came for the sick. He doesn't come for you if you're like, I'm good, I don't need you. He comes when you're calling on him. So yeah, it was a wrestle. And then even just being in God's word was difficult because with trauma, I literally couldn't write full sentences. My letters were being reversed. I started stuttering. And so there were all kinds of things that came out from the trauma that just practically made reading God's word very difficult. It felt like, looking at a puddle of letters instead of actual meaningful words. And during that time, something that helped me, and hopefully it might help your listeners, was I just was given a different version of the Bible. I was used to reading the ESV, and when I lost my ability to think straight, someone from the Hero Squad at American Bible Society sent me a contemporary English version, and it just was what I needed for the season. I still go back to my ESV now, but during that season, man, it was so beautiful to be like, wow, like I understand this again. And so even just changing the version of the Bible can be very helpful during a season of crisis when it just feels like nothing makes sense.
I think taking our brokenness to God is a healthy way of dealing with it, but sometimes it drives us away from God to where we don't want to take anything to God. Actually, we want to run the opposite direction. Did you have that season at any point?
I personally don't even remember, to be honest. Like there's some of it is such a fog, but I do know that I've had such a long history of trials and crises and tragedy in our family that I think by the point that I lost my husband, I felt like, okay, yes, I'm tempted to just walk away, God, but where else would I go? Like, honestly, I know there's nowhere else to turn. And so I would tell him that, but that's still me coming to him. Right?
Right.
That's still me coming to him saying, I wish I could go somewhere else, but you're all I have left. So I'm not sure quite how to answer that, but I think at the end of the day, I decided, as much as it would be great to just walk away, then what's left? Like, where else would I go?
I think that's a wonderful place to be, where you have nowhere else to go but God. I think, again, this is just perhaps just starting your grieving process in a healthy place, where you're not tempted to turn something outside of the realm of God. So what was one of the things about the grief process that you were most unprepared for?
I was not prepared for, I think two things are coming to mind. The physical consequences of grief. I was not prepared for how I would feel the weight across my shoulders, across my hips, the way it would kind of present itself in different parts of my body, and the exhaustion. I mean, it lasted years. Like it lasted forever, the way that it takes a physical toll on a person. And then driving became very, very difficult. And I did not see that coming. It was also kind of a scary feeling because you kind of get in this fog and you start driving through an intersection and you think back and you're like, I don't even remember if that was green or red actually, but I'm still alive and here we go. Like I'm still going. Like there are all these moments where just driving was very, very difficult. And I did not see that coming at all.
So in your book, you talk about the importance of being gracious and kind to yourself, because obviously it's not just an emotional strain like you just mentioned. It's a physical strain, and this is the time you have to really take care of yourself. So what are some practical ways that you have discovered that helped you get through this?
Yeah, just to go back on to the driving issue, to create to be gracious to myself, I had to say, you know what? I feel super uncomfortable doing that. And if possible, I would find someone who could help me get from A to B. That was a way of being gracious to myself, because I saw all of a sudden this, whatever task it was became super difficult and almost unsafe. And so it was a grace to myself to be able to just ask for help in that way. Another way that I learned to be gracious to myself during loss and crisis was just to create more margin, because I had to lower expectations of what I could accomplish and what I could handle in a day. And my to-do list had to shrink very, very small. And some days there was nothing on my to-do list. And That's definitely a grace that we can give ourselves, not every day of the week, because sometimes we're working overtime with all of the estate and the administration required. And it feels like we just inherited a new job to deal with all that stuff. So because of all the extra responsibilities and the roles that our person maybe played before in our lives, part of that is leaning into community and trying to find people who can, like, all right, my husband did our taxes. He did the lawn. He did, just kind of thought through what are all the things, the roles that he filled in our life. And I had to be like, okay, Lord, I need help. And I need people who can kind of step in some of these ways. That's super hard to find the people, for one, and to ask them and invite them into your story. But I think that's a huge way that someone can practically give themselves more grace, is to say, hey, you probably can't do it all. And especially not right now, you probably can't do it all. So we definitely have to start to lean on others.
Do you have children?
I do. Yeah, I have 2 little ones.
And how old are they?
They are now 7 and 12.
How did you help them get through that part?
Yeah, a lot of it was being open with where things were hard, with being honest about my shortcomings and asking forgiveness when I fell short. I prayed a pretty simple prayer, which was just, Jesus, help me love them well. Because I think sometimes at the end of the day or in the middle of the day, we're just so fried. There's no other way to say it. Exhausted, turned upside down. And our kids feel the same way. And so to acknowledge that, I think just that alone helps. But we definitely had different grieving styles in our family. Some of us wanted to talk about it, keep the memories alive by talking often. And for others of us, that was really triggering. And it actually triggered a bunch of trauma to discuss those things. And so we had to kind of talk openly about what one person needs versus what the other person needs, and try to identify those things and then try to really honor each other in that way, because we definitely all grieved in different ways. And sometimes that, adds another layer of making the family dynamic difficult. But we certainly, I think at the end of the day, it was like, Jesus, I need you. And just praying like, God, you say you're father of the fatherless. I need you to step in and father my kids right now. And it wasn't always a specific prayer or way, like do it this way or in this, timing. It was just like, God, help me. And I think those simple prayers get us through crisis season.
Very true. Very true. And of course, I'm just thinking how that added to your, in a sense, a burden to your process of going through grief, that you were also responsible for the emotions and the well-being of your children, which makes it that much more difficult. Earlier in our interview, you mentioned lament. So let's pause on this a little bit, because I think it's important. So let's talk about what is lament and how it can help those who are struggling with loss.
Sure. And I do just want to mention something that you said about it adding another layer of grief when you have your children through grief. It's also an extra unexpected joy to have kids with you through that season, because they, I don't know, they just really do help you continue on in the joy and seeing his face and their faces. Like, it's just such an added comfort in so many ways. So I definitely wanted to speak into that. And then lament, I love that you're asking that question. Many Christians that I'm, coming into conversation with have never heard that word before. So I guess I'll just simply define it as, for me, lament is getting honest with God about what's hard. And some people would like to nuance, lament is this or lament is that. It's not complaining, it's this. But honestly, I think it's just, if you're honest with God about what is hard in your life, then you are practicing lament. It's an ancient coping mechanism. I think it's an ancient mental health practice, and it's one that the church is just beginning to talk about again. And I'm so grateful because I think that it's a way that God has created for us to be able to let out some of the grief, the loss, the heaviness that's in our hearts, the suffering that we're dealing with in a way that it's not destructive, and it's actually helpful because instead of just letting it out, we're giving it to the Lord. And so he can do something with it. And it really does. When we lament and we're like, God, this is the ugly, honest, how I really feel. We kind of talked about that in the beginning of our interview. When we're honest with God about that, it really does open the door for the comforter to rush in. That's one of the names of the Holy Spirit, is comforter. And like we mentioned before, if we're like, I'm fine, everything is fine, that's not lamenting. That's the opposite of lamenting. And it's not honest, and it doesn't welcome him into that space to bring healing. So it's a really beautiful practice that we do have to actually practice. It's not easy when you first start to try to lament with the Lord and tell him how you're really feeling. It can sometimes be, it can sometimes be a scary thing or an awkward thing or an unknown thing, but it's always turned out so healing for me in my life.
This is very interesting because I think that for me, this is an unexplored practice. I mean, I'm aware of it, but what do you think? Like, when is it supposed to end? When does lament turn into complaining? Like, how is what is the healthy way of lamenting?
I don't worry about it being complaining. I don't worry about that at all. I just at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, how am I honestly feeling? And so I'll tell him. And usually you asked a great question, like, when does it end? Honestly, by the time you get it out and you tell him, and this usually happens when you're alone in your house, in the shower, in your closet, like, it's not a pretty thing to lament. But when that happens, there usually comes this place where, at least for me in my practice of it, this peace starts to come into your heart and your body, and you're like, So it kind of ends itself in that way, because it really does usher in a peace that can't be explained. And it truly does open a door for him to comfort you. And it doesn't mean your situation changed, but something major shifts in your heart when you're honest with God and when he can come in and bring some healing. So yeah, I love that question.
My lament, if I'm completely honest, sometimes it is complaining, but what happens is that God changes my perspective. So in the process of that, by the time I get to the end of it, I start seeing the situation from a different point of view. But that's not lament. I think that's more complaining. Lament, like you said, is truly being honest with God about how you feel, rather than asking why the situation happened. So that's a different thing. And I love what you said about your kids, because they are the inheritance that God gave you, the fruit of your relationship with your husband. So this is like the hope for the future. And I think that is so beautiful. You're blessed to have your kids, at the end of the day. Let's talk about the people in your life. Like, when someone is mourning, especially in a situation like this, if you were my friend, or even, I just met you today, but like, I'm at loss for words of what to tell you. I understand with my heart, and I feel so much compassion towards this situation that you have gone through. But how do you support practically a person who is going through grief?
Yeah, well, I love what you just said. If you want to know what to say, that's it. Like, say, I don't have words, but I have so much compassion. Like, that's beautiful. Because often what people, it kind of swings two ways, I've noticed. Either people don't know what to say, and so They don't say anything, which that's hard because it just leaves the person feeling more alone. Or they don't know what to say, so they just say something. And those some things can sometimes, not intentionally, but they can sometimes be extremely hurtful. So I love what you just said. That's a great example of what you could say. And then other ways to step in practically. I think that milestones they're things on the calendar that kind of trigger grief in a fresh way. So maybe if if someone lost their spouse, a wedding anniversary would be a difficult day to celebrate without that person, because that's not a day that everyone really celebrates. It was just you and your spouse. So remembering those days, as the friend, putting them in your calendar, on your phone, and having it set to remind you like forever, because what a person really needs is a long haul friend. There's going to be a lot of people that show up in the first couple of weeks. But that's when a person's in total shock and really doesn't even know what they need help with. But 2 months later, 5 months later, 6 months later, the 1 year anniversary of when that person died, and carrying on, like it's a long haul thing. 2 years out, 9 years out, 18 years out. It's the long haul, and their life will always be different, not just 2 weeks after. So I guess I would just offer that, keeping those special dates in your calendar, the day that person died, keeping that in your calendar. And you don't have to have magical words to say, but just, hey, I'm thinking of you today. I love you. And I would recommend not saying, I know you must feel ... I think we're really tempted to say that, but it's always better, I think, to ask a question than assume, oh, I'm sure you're doing this, or I'm sure this is an awful day. I don't think those phrases are helpful. So avoiding, I'm sure you must, or I know this must be, that would be a good little tip to avoid those things.
That's a great point. That's a great point, because we're tempted to say these words, maybe to express our compassion. But you're right. There's no way you can know how this person feels at the moment, unless maybe you have gone through a similar experience. And even then, so you talk about in your book about some creative ways that you have helped yourself to get through the grieving process. What are some of those?
Yeah, journaling has always been a great thing for my mental health personally, and for a lot of people. There's so many studies on gratitude and how it actually changes the chemical makeup of your brain. So trying to write down things you're grateful for, it can be so painful when you're in the middle of crisis and tragedy to even think of one thing. But even doing that with one thing, focusing on things you're thankful for, it really does create breakthrough. And then I like to draw and doodle out expressions of my grief, because sometimes, like we talked about before, when you can't even write a sentence, sometimes it came down to like stick figure pictures for me. So that's actually why in the devotional that I've written, When Mountains Crumble, there's a lot of doodle prompts where people can kind of draw out different ways of processing their story. And also, we have found equine therapy to be such a surprising healing place for me and my girls. It's cool how riding on a horse can actually reset neural pathways in a way that talk therapy, while that's super helpful when it comes to trauma, it kind of requires a more physical, or using the other side of the brain to bring some healing from what I've been learning. And so even just things like riding on a horse can be so healing in ways that we can't explain super well, but God knew when he made those creatures what he was doing. So that's pretty cool.
That is great, and great practical suggestions. And I mean, I'm sure it can be maybe something new that you have not tried before, because that probably activates some parts of your brain that you have not employed before. Now, in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn," but it doesn't really feel like a blessing. So what do you think Jesus meant when he said that?
Yeah. It really does not feel like a blessing to mourn, but it's interesting because there is a difference between grieving and mourning. Mourning is your public expression of your grief. So grief is you working out your loss, and it's your internal process and struggle there. But mourning is letting other people know that you're grieving. And so, like in Victorian times, they would put a black wreath on the door. They would dress all in black. There were different ways that they would symbolize and tell others, communicate to others, hey, this is a home that's grieving. Be gentle with us. In our culture, it's not as much of a longer season as like maybe it's a post we put on Facebook that I've lost this person that I love, or it's a band that you wear around your arm when you go on a memorial run or something like that. Those are different ways of publicly expressing that you've lost someone. And when we do that, we take a risk because yes, somebody could say something hurtful to us on accident or on purpose because of our loss, or we could risk that community steps in and that they're gentle with us and that people step in around us to help us through that season. So that's where the blessing is when we risk letting other people know that we're grieving, and then they actually step in and bring comfort in practical and prayerful ways.
This is very interesting, very new way to look at this verse for me personally. Mm-hmm. Well, what are some of the words of encouragement that you have for our listeners who are maybe going through loss or grief? And it's not always the loss of a loved one. It could be the loss of a relationship or the loss of a job. It's a process. So what would be some of the words of encouragement that you have?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, loss, it's so disorienting. It's so isolating. And at the end of the day, I think we just remembering that we're not alone, remembering that Jesus really does not ever forsake us. He really does not ever leave us. He will be with you to the end of the age. Like remembering those promises beyond how you feel, because I know that it feels like I have nobody left anymore. I know that it feels like often it can feel like nobody cares, nobody understands. Those feelings are valid and they're real. But the truth is that Jesus knows. He really does know how you feel. He experienced more suffering than we can imagine. And he experienced more grief and loss than we can imagine. God himself lost his own son. So we know that God can enter into this with us, and kind of wrestling the difference between what's true and what feels true. It's a really honest place to be.
Thank you so much, Danita, for this interview. And thank you for taking time to pour what you have learned into a book. I think this is quite a gift to the people who are facing similar circumstances. We're going to post a link to the book. I'm sure it's available on Amazon and perhaps on your website as well. So we'll put links to both, and hopefully that it will be a great blessing for those who decide to purchase it.
Thank you for sharing that. And I also have a free grief guide for people who want to know how to help someone through grief and for how to walk through grief themselves. I have 2 different guides there. So that's also available at whenmountainscrumble.com as a gift to your audience, as a way to just help them on their next step of their grief journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Danita's story shows that surrendering to God, even when we're tempted to walk away from Him, always leads to finding comfort and joy and hope. Her story is also a testimony of God's power to redeem our brokenness and use our experience to minister to others. I encourage you to pick up Danita's book, When Mountains Crumble. If you're not dealing with loss right now, this is a great tool to encourage someone in your life who is. At World Missions Alliance, we believe that changed lives change lives. If you would like to learn more about what we do, visit our website, rfwma.org. There, you can also find out how you can get involved and change the lives of others through your testimony. Again, our website is rfwma.org. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Limitless Spirit Podcast. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit Podcast is produced by World Missions Alliance. We believe that changed lives change lives. If you want to see your life transformed by Christ's love, or if you want to help those who are hurting and hopeless and discover your greater purpose in serving Christ through short-term missionary work, check out our website, rfwma.org, and find out how to get involved.